Greetings from the Bureau of Philippine Standards.
For this episode, we will be discussing the PH-EFTA TBT chapter. The PH-EFTA Free Trade Agreement, or the FTA, entered into force for the Philippines, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland on June 1, 2018.
One of the chapters of the FTA is the Technical Barriers to Trade, or TBT, in which the WTO TBT agreement is incorporated. In this webinar, we are going to discuss the salient features of the TBT chapter and its relevance under the PH-EFTA Free Trade Agreement.
The Chapter 5, or the Technical Barriers to Trade chapter of the PH-EFTA, is comprised of 10 articles as presented on the screen. First off is the objectives. The objectives of this chapter are to further the implementation of the TBT agreement, to facilitate bilateral trade and access to respective markets for goods within the scope of this chapter, to facilitate information exchange and cooperation in the field of technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment between the parties, and the enhanced mutual understanding of each party's regulatory system, to prevent, eliminate, or reduce unnecessary obstacles related to trade between the parties, in particular, to avoid duplications in the conformity assessment procedures, to further the implementation of good regulatory practice in the area of product safety, including market surveillance, and to effectively solve trade concerns affecting trade between the parties within the scope of this chapter.
The second article of the TBT chapter applies to the preparation, adoption, and application of all standards, technical regulations, and conformity assessment procedures which may affect trade in goods between the parties. It should be noted that sanitary and phytosanitary measures and purchasing specifications prepared by governmental bodies for production or consumption requirements of governmental bodies are not covered by this chapter. Before we proceed to the next chapter, let's define first what is standards, technical regulations, and conformity assessment procedures, or STRACAP. Standards are defined as a document approved by a recognized body that provides for common and repeated use, rules, guidelines, or characteristics for products or related processes and production method. It should be noted that standards are voluntary in nature. Thus, compliance is not mandatory. These standards may include or deal exclusively with terminologies, symbols, packaging, marking or labeling requirements as they apply to a product, process, or production method. On the other hand, technical regulation is a document which lays down product characteristics or the related processes and production methods, including the applicable administrative provisions. Unlike standards, compliance to technical regulation is mandatory. But this may also include or deal exclusively with terminologies, symbols, packaging, marking or labeling requirements as they apply to a product, process, or production method. And finally, a conformity assessment procedure is any procedure used, directly or indirectly, to determine that relevant requirements in technical regulations or standards are fulfilled. This may include product certification, inspection, and testing.
The third article of this chapter is the affirmation of the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. It stipulates that all rights and obligations set therein are carried in the chapter and must be adhered by both parties unless otherwise provided. One of the differences between the TBT agreement and the PH-EFTA TBT chapter is that the latter identifies international standards such as the ISO, the IEC, the ITU, and the CAC, while the TBT agreement does not. The next article of this chapter is the movement of products, border control, and market surveillance. This article specifically stipulates that goods fully complying with the relevant technical regulations of an importing party can freely move within their respective territories once placed on the market.
The next article is the conformity assessment procedures. It acknowledges or recognizes broad ranges of mechanisms to facilitate acceptance of conformity assessment results such as mutual recognition and accreditation. It also reinforces the use of international standards as basis of technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures. Moreover, it promotes use of accreditation of conformity assessment bodies based on international standards. And finally, where applicable, encourages the use of self-declaration of conformity. The next article is cooperation. Under this provision, the parties shall strengthen cooperation through activities of international standardization bodies and WTO TBT agreement, information exchange, communication between competent authorities, and the full text or summary of technical regulations notified to WTO members translated in English.
Article 5.8 of this chapter states that consultation shall be held at the request of a party which considers that another party has taken a measure which is likely to create or has created an obstacle to trade. It shall take place within 40 days from the receipt of the written request with the objective of finding a mutually acceptable solution. It shall take place in the joint committee if a party so requests, and it may be conducted by any agreed method. The parties shall jointly review this chapter no later than 4 years from the entry into force of this agreement, and thereafter upon requests by a party. The parties may conclude annexes or side agreements to this agreement to prevent, eliminate, or reduce unnecessary obstacles, including to avoid duplicative and unnecessarily burdensome conformity assessment procedures in specific product sectors. For the contact points, it shall exchange names and addresses for this chapter in order to facilitate communication and the exchange of information.
To understand the essence of this chapter on technical barriers to trade, it should be noted that there are existing technical regulations being implemented by the parties, and there could be more.
With the TBT chapter, rules on the adaptation and application of standards, technical regulations, and conformity assessment procedures will be governed by the TBT agreement, which leverages on transparency, non-discriminatory principles, international standards, and cooperation.
That concludes the episode on technical barriers to trade. Should you have any questions or clarifications, you may reach the DTI-Bureau of Philippine Standards through our official channels. Thank you and mabuhay!